"You have 10 days to wipe this ranch clean off the map." That was the first thing she said. No hello, no eye contact. I hadn't even put down my welding torch when the paper slammed onto my workbench. I'd heard plenty of stupid things from HOAs before. But this was the peak. I lived on land my grandfather left me. Before this road even had a name, and they thought a few lines of violation notices could drive me out? No. From that moment, I knew I was going to take action, and she was going to regret thinking she could win through power alone. Have you ever been threatened outright by an HOA? Comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I'll tell you how to turn their warning shots into a complete joke. The morning had started normal enough. I was out by the front gate welding a patch on the metal fencing that kept my cattle from wandering onto Meadowbrook Drive. The sun was already getting hot, sweat dripping down my back as sparks flew from the torch. That's when I heard it. The sharp click-clack of heels hitting concrete, getting closer and louder with each step. I looked up to see a woman stepping out of an older BMW sedan, the kind that used to be white but had faded to a dingy cream color. She was tapping her heel against my gate like she was marking time, while shooing away one of my horses that had wandered over to the fence line. The horse backed off, but I could tell by its ears that it didn't appreciate the attitude. She was wearing a purple dress that had seen better days, paired with a blazer that had fake fur trim around the collar, except half the fur was matted down, and the other half looked like it had been through a blender. Her shoes were those chunky heels that were probably expensive once, but now the tips were scuffed, and one had a visible crack running up the side. What really caught my attention was her makeup. It was the kind of over-the-top application that screamed, "I'm trying too hard." Mascara that was slightly smudged, lipstick that didn't quite follow her lip line, foundation that was just a shade too orange for her skin tone. This was someone who used to have it together, but was now barely holding on to the appearance of success. "Mr. Holt, I presume," she said, not waiting for an answer before marching right up to my workbench. "I'm Lynette Kerrigan, chairwoman of the Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association." She said it like she was announcing the arrival of royalty. "We need to discuss your property and its impact on our community standards." The way she said community standards made it sound like I was running some kind of toxic waste dump instead of a working cattle ranch. I set down my torch and wiped my hands on a rag, taking my time to really look at her. Up close, I could see the desperation she was trying to hide behind all that bravado. "What exactly is the problem, Miss Kerrigan?" I asked, keeping my voice level. I'd learned a long time ago that staying calm was the best way to handle people who came at you swinging. She pulled out a manila folder that was stuffed so full of papers it could barely close, and started rifling through it like she was looking for a smoking gun. "The problem, Mr. Holt, is that your ranch is bringing down property values for the entire neighborhood. Do you see those beautiful homes over there?" She pointed toward the HOA development that had sprung up about 5 years ago, a collection of cookie-cutter houses that all looked exactly the same except for their paint colors. "Those families paid good money to live in a well-maintained community, and your property is destroying their investment." I followed her gesture and looked at the houses she was so proud of. They were nice enough, I supposed, if you liked the kind of place where every lawn was exactly the same height and every mailbox was the exact same distance from the curb. But calling it beautiful was a stretch. It looked more like someone had taken one house design and copied it 30 times, changing only the color of the shutter. "I've been living here since before those houses existed," I told her. "In fact, I was here before this road was even paved. My family has owned this land for 3 generations. She waved her hand dismissively, like my family's history was just an inconvenience. "That's irrelevant now. Times change, Mr. Holt. This area is developing, and your ranch simply doesn't fit the vision we have for our community." That's when she dropped the bombshell. "You have 10 days to remove all livestock, tear down those unsightly outbuildings, and bring your property into compliance with neighborhood standards. After that, we'll be forced to take legal action." She slapped the violation notice down on my workbench with enough force to make my coffee mug jump. I picked up the paper and scanned through it quickly. It was 3 pages of the most ridiculous complaints I'd ever seen. Excessive noise from livestock, unpleasant odors affecting neighboring properties, heavy vehicles creating road damage, structures not in keeping with neighborhood aesthetic. Every single item was either completely made up or a natural part of running a working ranch. "And if I refuse?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Her smile turned cold, the kind of expression that told me this conversation was about more than just property values. "Then we'll make sure you understand that there are consequences for people who don't cooperate with community improvement efforts." As she turned to leave, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A second car had been parked across the street the whole time. a black pickup truck with tinted windows. As Lynette walked back to her BMW, a man got out of the truck and walked over to her. He was tall, maybe in his 50s, wearing work clothes, but carrying himself like someone who was used to being in charge. They had a brief conversation that I couldn't hear, but I could see him nodding along with whatever she was saying. Then he looked directly at me and gave a slight nod, like he was acknowledging that I was now on his radar. 1 week later, I found myself sitting in the Meadowbrook Heights Community Center, surrounded by folding chairs and the kind of fluorescent lighting that makes everything look like a crime scene. The room was cold enough that I could see my breath, and the humming from the overhead lights had that irregular flicker that made you wonder if the whole place was about to lose power. Lynette had set up at the front of the room with a laptop and projector, and she'd arranged the chairs in neat rows like we were all students about to get a lecture. About 20 people had shown up, which was probably more than had ever attended an HOA meeting in the history of the development. The first thing Lynette did was dim the lights and fire up her PowerPoint presentation. The opening slide read, "Community Standards Enforcement, Protecting Our Investment," in bold red letters. Then came the photos. She'd taken pictures of my ranch from every possible angle, and she'd blown them up on the screen so that every detail looked as dramatic as possible. There was my barn, which looked perfectly normal to me, but in her presentation it was labeled as "Deteriorating Structure Affecting Neighborhood Aesthetics." There were my cattle, peacefully grazing in the pasture, but her caption read, "Livestock Creating Noise and Odor Violations." She'd even managed to get a photo of my old pickup truck, which she'd labeled as "Heavy Commercial Vehicle Damaging Public Roads." What really got to me was how she'd edited some of the photos. She'd taken pictures during the morning feeding time, when there's always a bit of dust in the air and the animals are more active, making everything look chaotic and dirty. She'd zoomed in on a water trough that needed cleaning and made it look like some kind of environmental hazard. She'd photographed the manure pile from the angle that made it look biggest, even though it was properly composted and located exactly where it was supposed to be according to county regulations. Every single photo was designed to make my ranch look like it was one step away from being condemned by the health department. As she clicked through her presentation, I noticed the man from the pickup truck sitting in the back row. He wasn't participating in the meeting at all, just observing. Every time Lynette made a point about property values or community standards, he would give a slight nod, like he was keeping score. I'd never seen him before that day at my ranch, but something about the way he was watching the proceedings made me think he had a lot more invested in this than just being a concerned neighbor. His clothes were clean but worn, the kind of work clothes that someone wears when they want to blend in but aren't actually doing manual labor. His boots were expensive, the kind that cost more than most people make in a week. When Lynette finished her presentation, she opened the floor for comments. That's when things got interesting. A woman named Colleen Rhodes, who I'd never met before, stood up from the third row. She was carrying a manila envelope that looked suspiciously similar to the one Lynette had brought to my ranch. "Before we discuss Mr. Holt's property," she said in a voice that carried clearly through the room, "I think we need to discuss some other community standards issues." She walked to the front of the room and dumped the contents of her envelope onto the table where Lynette was sitting. "These are emails that our chairwoman has sent to 7 different families in this neighborhood over the past 6 months. The room went completely silent, except for the humming of those fluorescent lights. Colleen picked up the first email and read it out loud. "Mrs. Patterson, your rose bushes are extending 6 inches beyond the approved setback line. You have 48 hours to trim them or face fines of $50 per day." She picked up another one. "Mr. Chen, your mailbox post is showing signs of weathering that detract from neighborhood appearance. Replacement is required within 1 week." And another, "The Williams family, your children's bicycles were observed in your driveway for more than the allowed 2-hour period. This is your final warning before penalties are assessed." As Colleen continued reading, I could see several people in the audience pulling out their phones. Some were taking pictures of the emails, others were starting to record video. In today's world, nothing stays private for long, and I had a feeling this meeting was about to become a lot more public than Lynette had planned. The look on Lynette's face was priceless. She'd gone from confident community leader to deer in headlights in about 30 seconds. She kept glancing back at the man in the back row, like she was looking for some kind of signal about how to handle this unexpected turn of events. "These emails show a pattern of harassment that goes far beyond reasonable community standards," Colleen continued. 7 families have been threatened with fines for violations that most people wouldn't even notice. Mrs. Patterson's roses were beautiful and well-maintained. Mr. Chen's mailbox was perfectly functional. The Williams children were playing in their own driveway. This isn't about maintaining property values. This is about one person using HOA rules to intimidate and control her neighbors. The murmur that went through the room told me that Colleen had hit a nerve. Several people were nodding along, and I could see others looking at Lynette with new eyes. Lynette tried to regain control of the situation, but her voice had lost that commanding tone she'd used with me. These enforcement actions were all within HOA guidelines, she said, but she sounded defensive now. Community standards exist for a reason, and selective enforcement would be unfair to residents who do follow the rules. But Colleen wasn't done. Speaking of selective enforcement, she said, I've walked through this entire neighborhood, and I can point out violations on almost every street. Dead grass, peeling paint, cracked driveways, overflowing trash cans. But somehow only certain families seem to get violation notices. The families that have questioned your decisions or spoken up at meetings. That's when the man in the back row decided he'd heard enough. He stood up quietly and made his way toward the exit, but not before stopping at Lynette's table. He leaned down and whispered something in her ear that I couldn't hear, but I could see her face go pale. Then he straightened up and walked out without saying a word to anyone else. As the door closed behind him, Lynette seemed to gather herself again. This meeting has gotten off track, she announced. We're here to discuss Mr. Holt's property violations, not to relitigate past enforcement decisions. But the damage was done. The room was buzzing with conversation, and I could tell that Lynette had lost whatever authority she'd had when the meeting started. As people started filing out, several of them stopped to shake my hand or pat me on the shoulder. Don't let them push you around, one older gentleman told me. This neighborhood was better before all these rules and regulations. A woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Patterson, the one with the famous roses, said, If you need anything, just let us know. Some of us remember what it was like to have reasonable neighbors. As I walked to my truck, I noticed Lynette was still in the parking lot, talking on her phone. I was too far away to hear what she was saying, but her body language told me she was either very angry or very scared. Maybe both. Whatever that man had whispered to her had clearly changed her plans, and I had a feeling that Monday was going to bring a whole new level of trouble to my quiet ranch. 3 days later, I was out doing the morning feeding when I noticed something wrong with the water in the cattle trough. Instead of the clear, clean water that should have been there, the surface was covered with a thin layer of foam, and there was a chemical smell that made my nose burn. My cattle were standing around the trough, but refusing to drink, which was unusual because they were normally eager for their morning water. I'd been ranching long enough to know that when animals won't drink, there's usually a very good reason. The smell was sharp and artificial, nothing like the natural odors you'd expect around a working ranch. I immediately shut off the water supply and started investigating. The main water line that fed the trough came from a well about 50 yards away, and the pipe ran underground most of the way. But there was one section where it came above ground across a small drainage ditch, and that's where I found the problem. Someone had drilled a small hole in the PVC pipe and inserted what looked like a funnel. The area around the pipe was stained with chemical residue, and there were footprints in the soft soil that definitely weren't mine. These weren't the kind of tracks you'd get from someone just walking by. They were the deep, deliberate prints of people who had spent time working in that spot. I'd had enough problems with Lynette and her HOA to know that this wasn't an accident. Someone had deliberately contaminated my water supply, probably hoping that when the environmental inspectors showed up, they'd find evidence of pollution coming from my ranch. It was a clever plan, actually. Create the problem you're complaining about, then use it as justification for legal action. But they'd made one mistake. They'd assumed I wouldn't notice the contamination before the inspectors arrived. I immediately called my neighbor Miles Dean, who worked as an electrician and knew a thing or two about security systems. You need cameras, Miles told me when he saw the contaminated water line. And not just any cameras, you need the kind that record in low light and have motion activation. If someone's messing with your property, you want evidence that'll hold up in court. We spent the rest of the day installing a network of small wireless cameras around the ranch. We put them in trees, on fence posts, and in other locations where they'd be hidden, but still get good coverage of the important areas. The cameras were connected to a system that would alert my phone whenever they detected motion, and they automatically uploaded everything to cloud storage. I didn't have to wait long for results. At 2:15 the next morning, my phone buzzed with a motion alert. I pulled up the camera feed and couldn't believe what I was seeing. 3 men in dark hoodies were walking across my property, carrying what looked like containers of some kind. One of them was the man from the HOA meeting. I could tell by his height and the way he walked, even with his face partially hidden. They went straight to the water line and began pouring something from their containers into the hole they'd drilled earlier. The whole operation took less than 10 minutes, and they were careful to cover their tracks as they left. But here's where it gets interesting. Instead of calling the police right away, I decided to wait and see what would happen next. I had a feeling that if I could catch them in the act on camera, It would be much more valuable than just reporting the contamination after the fact. Sure enough, at 8:30 that same morning, I got a call from the county environmental office. "Mr. Holt, we've received a complaint about possible water contamination on your property. We need to send an inspector out this afternoon." I told them that would be fine, and that I had some information they might find interesting. Before the inspector arrived, I uploaded the camera footage to a video sharing platform. I didn't include any commentary, just the raw footage of 3 men contaminating my water supply in the middle of the night. I titled it "Environmental Sabotage Caught on Camera" and shared it with a few neighbors who had seemed sympathetic at the HOA meeting. By the time the inspector showed up at my ranch, the video had already been viewed over 200 times and was starting to get comments from people who recognized the location. The inspector was a professional woman named Janet Morrison who had clearly seen every kind of environmental issue you could imagine. When I showed her the contaminated water line, she took samples and photographs, but I could tell she was suspicious about how obvious the contamination was. In my experience, she told me, when someone deliberately contaminates their own water supply for insurance or legal purposes, they usually don't make it this obvious. This looks more like someone wanted to make sure the contamination would be discovered quickly. That's when I showed her the camera footage. Janet watched the video twice, taking notes the whole time. "This is definitely sabotage," she said finally, "and whoever did it was sloppy enough to get caught on camera. I'll need copies of this footage for our investigation, and I'll be recommending that the county prosecutor look into filing charges." She explained that deliberately contaminating someone else's water supply was a serious crime, especially when livestock were involved. "These people could be looking at felony charges if we can identify them," she told me. "Environmental crimes are taken very seriously, particularly when they involve potential harm to animals or agriculture." As Janet was finishing up her inspection, my phone rang. It was Lynette, and she did not sound happy. "I know what you're trying to do with that video," she said without any kind of greeting. "You think you're clever, but this is just the beginning. We have other options for dealing with people who won't cooperate." Her voice had an edge to it that I hadn't heard before, like she was barely keeping her temper under control. "You've made this personal now, and that was a mistake. You have no idea what you're up against." Before I could respond, she hung up. But something about the way she'd said "other options" made me think that the contamination plot was just the opening move in a much larger game. After Lynette's threatening phone call, I realized I needed to stop playing defense and start gathering some intelligence of my own. The water contamination incident had shown me that this wasn't just about HOA violations. There was something bigger going on. So I did what any smart rancher would do when faced with predators. I started studying my enemies. I hired a private investigator named Rebecca Torres who specialized in financial investigations. I didn't need her to follow anyone around or take photographs. I needed her to dig into the money trail and find out who was really behind this campaign to get rid of my ranch. What Rebecca found blew my mind. The Meadowbrook Heights HOA was broke, completely and utterly broke. The records were messy. Fake repairs, bloated charges, and a clear paper trail of misuse. Edith Morse, the HOA secretary, had been using community funds like her personal piggy bank. Nearly $40,000 had vanished into her gambling debts and credit card bills. But the real shocker? They owed back taxes for 5 straight years, almost $200,000 that nobody seemed to know about. Then Rebecca traced Victor Langston's real game plan. This guy wasn't just some concerned neighbor. He owned a construction company that built luxury resorts. He'd been quietly buying up properties around Meadowbrook Heights for 2 years, 4 houses plus several vacant lots. My ranch sat right in the middle of what would be his perfect resort development. Everything suddenly made sense. The water contamination, the harassment, the legal pressure, it was all designed to drive me out, so Victor could complete his land grab. For the first time since this mess started, I felt overwhelmed. Victor had money, connections, and a master plan. Lynette had legal authority and a willingness to break laws. And here I was, just one guy trying to hold on to Grandpa's land. Maybe they were right. Maybe I should just take whatever money I could get and start over somewhere else. The stress was eating at me, making me second-guess everything I thought I knew about fighting back against bullies. That's when Victor showed up with his briefcase and his reasonable offer. He looked different this time. Expensive suit, silk tie, leather shoes, worth more than most people's monthly salary. This was Victor in full businessman mode, trying to look legitimate, instead of like someone who poisoned water supplies in the middle of the night. "Mr. Holt," he said with that fake smile, "I think we got off on the wrong foot. I'm here with an offer that solves everyone's problem. $350,000. It sounded like serious money until you realized my property was worth at least $600,000 at current market rates. Victor wanted me to sell at 40% below value, with a 30-day closing and no contingencies. I know it seems low, he said, watching my reaction, but consider your situation. Legal action from the HOA, potential environmental fines, ongoing defense costs. This offer lets you walk away clean with enough money to start fresh somewhere else. I was tempted, really tempted. The idea of just taking the money and disappearing sounded incredibly appealing after weeks of constant stress. I could buy a smaller place in the mountains, somewhere I'd always wanted to live. No HOAs, no development pressure, no people who thought my way of life was offensive to their property values. For about 10 minutes, I seriously considered signing those papers and ending the whole nightmare. But then I remembered what my neighbor Miles had told me after that HOA meeting. This land is the memory of the whole community, he'd said. Your family's been here since before any of these houses existed. If you give it up now, what's left? Miles was absolutely right. This wasn't just about me or my ranch anymore. It was about whether people like Victor could steamroll anyone who stood in their way. It was about whether communities could keep their character, or whether everything had to become cookie-cutter developments and luxury resorts. Instead of signing Victor's papers, I did something that surprised even me. I told him I needed time to think, then immediately called the county tax office. My question was simple. If someone owed back taxes, could a third party pay those taxes and get a lien on the property? The answer was yes, and it was simpler than I'd expected. If the HOA couldn't pay within 90 days of notification, the county would auction their common property. Anyone could bid, and the highest bidder would own whatever the HOA used to control. The numbers were even better than Rebecca had found. With penalties and interest, the HOA owed $230,000. They'd been sent multiple notices over 6 months, but never responded. The county was already preparing for auction, with one final notice going out in exactly 2 weeks. After that, the HOA would have 30 more days to pay up or lose everything they controlled. That's when the crazy idea hit me. What if, instead of selling my ranch to Victor, I bought the HOA's debt from the county? It was perfectly legal, and it would put me in position to force a sale of their property if they couldn't pay. The beautiful irony was overwhelming. Instead of being kicked off my own land, I could end up owning the land that gave them authority to harass me in the first place. I called my lawyer Graham Wexler to make sure I understood the implications. His response was immediate. That's brilliant. Completely legal. If you can come up with the money, you could end up owning their entire development. The hunter was about to become the hunted, and Victor and Lynette had no idea what was coming their way. 2 weeks later, I walked into the county office with a cashier's check for $237,000. It was most of my savings plus a loan against my ranch, but seeing the county clerk's face when I explained what I wanted was priceless. "You want to pay the HOA's back taxes?" she asked, like she'd never heard such a thing. "That's unusual, but perfectly legal. Once you pay their debt, you have all creditor rights, including forcing a sale if they default on repayment." The county sent official notification to every Meadowbrook Heights property owner. Their HOA debt had been paid by a third party, me, and now they owed the money to me instead of the county. They had 60 days to repay the full amount plus reasonable interest, or I could petition for public auction of their common property. I sent Lynette a personal copy with a note. "Thought you might find this development interesting. Let me know if you'd like to discuss repayment terms." My phone exploded within an hour. Some callers were furious, demanding to know what gave me the right to interfere in HOA business. Others were confused, asking if they now had to pay me directly for HOA fees. A few were actually supportive, glad someone was finally holding the HOA accountable for their financial disasters. But the call I was waiting for came just before dinner. "Lynette, what do you think you're doing?" she screamed. "You can't just buy our debt. That's not how HOAs work." The panic in her voice told me she was finally understanding her position. "Actually," I replied calmly, "that's exactly how debt works. Your organization owed money to the county. I paid it. Now you owe me. If you can't pay back, I have the same rights the county had, including forcing asset sales to recover the debt." The beautiful part was that I didn't need them to pay me back. Under law, as long as I could prove the HOA was financially insolvent, I could petition for public auction of their common property. Thanks to Edith's creative accounting, I had plenty of evidence. Rebecca had traced the missing funds to Edith's personal accounts, with bank records showing exactly where the money went. The HOA couldn't repay because they literally didn't have the money. 3 days later, an HOA lawyer called wanting to negotiate a settlement with structured repayment over time. "My clients are prepared to offer a reasonable payment plan," he said. with fair interest and a workable timeline. I told him I'd consider it, but only with conditions. Lynette had to resign as chairwoman immediately, Edith had to repay all stolen HOA funds, and Victor had to publicly disclose his financial interests and remove himself from any HOA decision. The lawyer said he'd get back to me, but I wasn't holding my breath. Even if they agreed to my conditions, they couldn't come up with the money. The HOA had been operating in the red for years, and most homeowners were already struggling with regular fees. Adding $200,000 in debt repayment would require special assessments that many residents couldn't afford. That's when I realized I had an even more satisfying option. Instead of waiting for them to fail at repayment, I could simply petition for public auction. Once I owned their common property, I could do whatever I wanted with it. Sell to developers, turn it into cattle pasture, or, the option that appealed most, auction it in small parcels and let the community decide their new neighbors. Everything I was doing was completely legal and followed established debt collection procedures. Graham Wexler started the auction petition paperwork. "This is fascinating," he told me. "I've never seen an individual property owner end up owning an entire HOA's assets, but there's no legal reason it can't happen. If the court approves, you'll own all common areas, the community center, playground, even entrance signs. You'll have more control over that neighborhood than the HOA." The hearing was scheduled for Wednesday. I had to appear before a judge and prove the HOA couldn't repay their debt and that public auction was appropriate remedy. Given the evidence about their financial situation, Graham was confident the judge would approve. "Bring copies of all bank records," he advised. "Be prepared to explain exactly how you want the auction conducted. The judge will want everything done fairly and legally." As the hearing approached, I started getting calls from people I'd never heard from. Real estate investors wanting partnership deals, lawyers offering representation for a percentage of auction gains, even a newspaper reporter wanting to cover the unusual legal battle between a rancher and his HOA. But the most surprising call came from Colleen Rhodes, the woman who'd exposed Lynette's harassment tactics at that first meeting. "I wanted you to know quite a few neighborhood people are rooting for you," she said. "A lot of us are tired of how the HOA's been run, and we think it's time for change. If you end up owning our common property, we hope you'll consider working with residents who want more reasonable community management." That conversation made me realize this wasn't just about revenge on Lynette and Victor. It was about whether the community could function without the authoritarian control that had made life miserable for so many residents. The pieces were falling into place perfectly. In a few days, I'd be standing before a judge with the power to completely flip the script on everyone who'd tried to drive me off my own land. The courtroom was packed on hearing day. Meadowbrook Heights residents, real estate investors, lawyers, and reporters filled every seat. Lynette sat with her attorney, looking like she hadn't slept in days. Her usual over-the-top makeup was gone, replaced by dark circles and trembling hands. Victor was notably absent. He'd clearly decided to distance himself rather than risk public association with the HOA's financial disasters. Judge Patricia Harrison called the hearing to order and asked me to present my case. Graham laid out the facts simply and clearly. "Your Honor, my client paid $237,000 in back taxes owed by Meadowbrook Heights HOA. State law makes him a creditor with rights to seek debt recovery. The HOA had 60 days to repay and has been unable to do so. We're requesting court-ordered public auction of their common property so Mr. Holt can recover the money he's owed." The judge reviewed our financial records, bank statements, tax notices, documentation of Edith's embezzlement. After several minutes of examination and questions about specific transactions, Judge Harrison looked up with a serious expression. "These records show clear financial mismanagement and potential criminal activity. Ms. Morse appears to have diverted significant funds for personal use. Is that correct?" Lynette's attorney tried arguing the HOA should get more time to arrange repayment, but the judge wasn't buying it. "Counselor, your clients had 5 years to address tax obligations and 60 additional days to repay Mr. Holt. Financial records show they simply don't have resources to meet obligations. Unless you can demonstrate access to funds not reflected in these documents, I'm inclined to grant Mr. Holt's auction petition." That's when Lynette snapped. She suddenly stood up and asked to address the court directly. Her attorney tried stopping her, but she ignored him and walked to the podium. "Your Honor, Mr. Holt has been harassing our community for months, violating HOA regulations, contaminating local water supplies, and now trying to steal our property through legal manipulation. This isn't about collecting debt, this is revenge." Her voice got louder and more emotional, and I could see the judge's expression growing stern. "Ms. Kerrigan," Judge Harrison said firmly, "do you have evidence supporting these accusations?" Lynette started to respond, then seemed to realize she had no proof. The water contamination had been proven as sabotage against my property, not something I'd done. HOA violations were fabricated or subjective. The legal process I was using was exactly what any creditor would do. We have documentation of his violations, she said weakly, unable to produce anything that would stand up in court. Judge Harrison lost patience quickly. Ms. Kerrigan, this is debt collection proceedings, not a forum for airing community disputes. If you have legitimate complaints about Mr. Holt's conduct, pursue them through appropriate legal channels. Those issues have no bearing on whether your organization owes him money or his right to seek recovery through public auction. She turned back to Graham and me. Mr. Holt, how do you propose conducting this auction? Graham explained we wanted standard real estate auction procedures. 30 days of newspaper advertising, giving anyone opportunity to bid. All bidding conducted openly, highest bidder winning purchase rights. Proceeds would go first to repaying my debt, with any excess returning to the HOA. We're not trying to circumvent normal processes, Your Honor. We just want to recover money Mr. Holt is legally owed. The judge approved the petition and set the auction date for 30 days later. As we left the courtroom, I could see Lynette frantically talking on her phone, probably trying to find someone who could lend the HOA enough money to stop the auction. But I knew from Rebecca's investigation that HOA members were already struggling with regular assessments. Most didn't have the kind of money it would take to pay off $200,000 in debt. Over the following weeks, word of the upcoming auction spread throughout the real estate community. Developers called wanting to bid on the property. Investors thought it would make good rental income. Community groups had ideas about turning it into public space. But the most interesting call came from a coalition of residents, led by Colleen Rhodes. They wanted to know if they could bid on the property themselves and return it to community ownership under better management. We've been talking to neighbors, and we think we can raise enough money for a competitive bid, Colleen told me. A lot of people are frustrated with HOA management, but we still want to maintain community areas and facilities. If we could buy the property and start over with new leadership and better financial management, it might be the best outcome for everyone. I told her it was a great idea, and I'd be happy to work with them regardless of who won. The auction was set for Saturday morning in the county courthouse parking lot. About 50 people showed up, reporters, investors, and a large group of Meadowbrook Heights residents. Lynette was there too, looking desperate and defeated. She'd clearly tried putting together a last-minute bid, but couldn't raise the money. When the auctioneer called for opening bids, 3 hands went up. Mine, developer Johnson, and Colleen representing the resident coalition. The real battle was about to begin. The aftermath of the auction was everything I'd hoped for and more. Lynette, faced with the reality that she no longer had any authority over the community, resigned from her position as HOA chairwoman and put her house up for sale within a week. Word around the neighborhood was that she'd taken a job in another state and was planning to leave town as soon as her house sold. The stress of the legal battle, combined with the public exposure of the HOA's financial problems, had clearly taken its toll on her. Without the power of the HOA behind her, she was just another person with too much makeup and a bad attitude. Victor Langston's situation was even more interesting. Once the auction results became public, several other property owners in the area started asking questions about his development plans and his relationship with the former HOA leadership. It turned out that his contamination of my water supply was just the tip of the iceberg. Rebecca's investigation had uncovered evidence that he'd been involved in similar schemes in other communities, using HOA pressure to force out property owners who stood in the way of his development projects. The county prosecutor was now looking into criminal charges related to environmental sabotage and conspiracy. Edith Morse, the former HOA secretary who had embezzled community funds, was facing her own legal problems. The resident coalition had decided to press charges for theft and fraud, and the evidence Rebecca had gathered made it a pretty straightforward case. Edith had already fled the state, but there were warrants out for her arrest in multiple jurisdictions. It turned out that the Meadowbrook Heights money wasn't the only community fund she'd been raiding. She'd been running the same scam in HOAs across 3 different states, always staying one step ahead of the law until she'd finally gotten too greedy and careless. The best part of the whole situation was watching the community transform under new leadership. Colleen Rhodes was elected as the new HOA chairwoman, and one of her first acts was to review and eliminate most of the petty regulations that had made life miserable for so many residents. The roses were allowed to grow 6 inches beyond the setback line. Children could leave their bicycles in the driveway. Mailboxes were allowed to show normal signs of weathering without triggering violation notices. The community centers started hosting actual community events instead of enforcement meetings. But what really made me happy was the relationship that developed between my ranch and the new HOA. Instead of treating my property like an eyesore that hurt their property values, they embraced it as part of the community's character. Some of the residents started bringing their children over to see the cattle and learn about ranch life. During the summer, we organized educational tours that taught kids about agriculture and animal husbandry. The community even voted to change their entrance sign to read Meadowbrook Heights, a community that values its rural heritage. Miles Dean, my neighbor who had helped me install the security cameras that caught Victor in the act, became something of a local hero. His electrical work had provided the evidence that exposed the whole conspiracy, and the resident coalition asked him to serve on their new board of directors. I never thought I'd be involved in HOA politics, he told me with a laugh, but I guess when you catch criminals on camera, people start to trust your judgment about other things too. 3 months after the auction, I received an unexpected visitor. It was a reporter from a national news magazine who had heard about the story and wanted to write about it as an example of how communities can fight back against abusive HOAs. This is exactly the kind of story people need to hear, she told me. Too many people feel powerless when they're faced with unreasonable authority figures, but you proved that there are legal ways to fight back and win. The article, when it was published, generated hundreds of responses from people around the country who had their own HOA horror stories. The legal resolution of everything took almost a year, but it was worth the wait. Victor pleaded guilty to environmental crimes and was sentenced to 2 years of community service, plus restitution for the cleanup costs and veterinary bills related to the water contamination. His construction company was fined heavily and lost its license to operate in the county. Edith was eventually arrested in Florida and extradited back to face fraud charges. She ended up serving 18 months in prison and was ordered to pay back all the money she'd stolen from various community organizations. As for Lynette, she disappeared from the area entirely after selling her house. I heard through the grapevine that she'd moved to Arizona and taken a job as a retail manager, far away from any HOA authority. I actually felt a little sorry for her in the end. She'd gotten caught up in a scheme that was bigger than she was, and her need for control and authority had made her an easy target for someone like Victor, who knew how to manipulate people's insecurities and ambition. The most satisfying part of the whole experience was that my ranch never changed at all. I still get up before dawn to feed the cattle. I still spend my days mending fences and maintaining equipment. I still live in the same house my grandfather built, on the same land my family has worked for 3 generations. But now, instead of being seen as a problem that needed to be solved, my ranch is valued as an important part of the community's identity. The new HOA even helped me apply for a state grant to preserve the property as agricultural land, ensuring that it will remain a working ranch for future generations. Looking back on everything that happened, I realized that the key was not letting them intimidate me into giving up. When Lynette first showed up with her violation notices and ultimatums, I could have just sold the ranch and moved away. It would have been easier and probably less stressful, but sometimes you have to fight for what's right, not just for yourself but for everyone who comes after you. The residents of Meadowbrook Heights deserved better leadership than Lynette and Victor were providing, and my land deserved better than being turned into another generic development project. The whole experience taught me that most bullies, whether they're individuals or institutions, are actually pretty fragile when you shine a light on what they're really doing. Lynette's power depended on people being afraid to challenge her authority. Victor's schemes only worked when nobody was paying attention to the money trail. Edith's embezzlement continued because no one was asking hard questions about where the community funds were really going. Once those things were exposed to public scrutiny, the whole corrupt system collapsed pretty quickly. If you're facing something similar in your own community, remember that you have more power than you think. Public records are available to anyone who asks for them. Financial documents can be subpoenaed if there's evidence of wrongdoing. Security cameras can capture evidence of criminal activity. And most importantly, there are usually other people in your community who are just as frustrated as you are, but who haven't found a way to organize and fight back effectively. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand up and say enough to change everything. The ranch is quiet again now, the way it was before this whole mess started. But it's a different kind of quiet. Not the tense silence of waiting for the next attack, but the peaceful calm of knowing that you've stood your ground and won. My cattle graze in the same pastures they always have, but now they're part of a community that values their presence instead of seeing them as a problem. And every morning when I walk out to do the feeding, I remember that sometimes the best way to preserve what you love is to fight for it with everything you've got. If you enjoyed this story of standing up to HOA bullies, let me know in the comments what you think about communities that value their rural heritage versus those that prioritize uniformity and control. Have you ever had to fight for your property rights? I'd love to hear your experiences and advice for others facing similar situations.